Have you ever put something in your mouth and known instantly, without proof, without confirmation, without anyone saying a word, that it was never meant for you? Not because it tasted bad, not because it was spoiled, but because something deep inside you recognized disrespect before your mind could name it. That's how my story begins, not with shouting or tears, but with a spoon hovering in midair and a smell that didn't belong to any kitchen I had known for 78 years. My name is Evelyn, and this is my true story from Indiana, a place of quiet streets and polite smiles where people assume age makes you dull and silence means you don't understand what's happening to you. I moved into my son's house after a fall that left my hip cracked and my confidence shaken. And when Daniel told me it would only be for a little while, I believed him, because mothers often believe even when their instincts whisper caution. His wife welcomed me with a smile that showed too many teeth and warmth that didn't quite reach her eyes, and I told myself I was imagining it, because when you're older, you're trained to doubt your own perceptions before questioning someone younger, louder, and more certain. That first evening, the house felt unfamiliar in a way I couldn't explain, too clean, too controlled, like a hotel pretending to be a home. And when she set the bowl in front of me, steaming and brown and thick, I noticed how she didn't sit down to eat with me, how she stayed standing, scrolling her phone, already bored with my presence. I've eaten simple food all my life, stretch meals, soup nights, whatever got us through winter, so poverty wasn't new to me, but this was different, the texture wrong, the scent metallic and sweet in a way that made my stomach tight, and when I lifted the spoon, I paused not because I was weak, but because something ancient inside me was paying attention. The first taste confirmed what my nose already knew, grainy, heavy, clinging to my tongue like it didn't want to be swallowed. And I swallowed anyway, not because I enjoyed it, but because I needed to know if I was imagining things. Across the room, their dog sat by his bowl, tail wagging, licking the same brown mush from ceramic shaped like a bone, and I felt a flicker of something sharp move through my chest, not anger yet, just awareness. When I set the spoon down, she laughed, not loudly, just enough to let me know she noticed, and she said something about me being sensitive, about food being food, about how everyone eats the same in this house. And then she said it lightly, carelessly, as if it were a joke that didn't deserve a response, that since I was living off them now, eating what the dog ate was only fair. I didn't react, not because I didn't understand, but because I understood too well, and I knew that reacting in that moment would give her what she wanted, confirmation that she had power. Instead, I smiled the way women my age are trained to smile, small and polite and empty, and I ate just enough to satisfy her curiosity, storing the rest of the truth for later. That night in the small guest room with no pictures and no curtains, I sat on the edge of the bed and realized something important. She wasn't just feeding me food I didn't recognize, she was feeding me humiliation, and she expected me to swallow that too. I listened to the house settle, the low hum of a refrigerator I didn't have access to, the soft click of her phone in the kitchen, the dog's nails on hardwood, and when the house finally went quiet, I stood up, slow and careful, not because I was fragile, but because I didn't want to be heard. The trash under the sink was heavier than it should have been, and buried beneath paper towels and peels was a cardboard sleeve that caught my eye, glossy, expensive looking, nothing like the cheap groceries I'd been served, and printed on it were words that didn't belong in any human meal. I didn't take it, I didn't confront her, I didn't cry, because crying would have meant surprise, and I wasn't surprised anymore, just focused. Back in my room, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, realizing that the most dangerous mistake someone can make is assuming silence means stupidity, because silence is often a choice, and I had just made mine. The next morning, I forgot my cane on purpose, repeated myself on purpose, moved slower than I needed to, and watched how her confidence grew with every assumption she made about my mind, because people reveal themselves fully when they think you're no longer paying attention. By the time she placed another bowl in front of me that evening, smiling like she'd already won, I knew something she didn't. This was no longer about food, and it was no longer about survival. It was about observation, and I had been observing my whole life. I ate quietly again, folded the rest into a napkin when she wasn't looking, and understood that this was only the beginning, because once you recognize disrespect, you can't unsee it, and once you decide not to confront it immediately, you gain something far more valuable than anger, you gain time. And time, when used properly, is how stories like mine stop being about humiliation and start becoming something else entirely, something she never imagined when she thought I wouldn't notice. That night, I didn't pray for strength. I checked the trash again, and what I found there told me exactly how long this had been happening. What happens when someone decides you are no longer worth explaining things to, when courtesy is replaced by convenience and kindness is quietly rationed the way food is. I didn't ask that question out loud, but it followed me through the house in Indiana like a shadow, growing longer every day I stayed silent. After that first night, nothing dramatic changed on the surface, and that was the clever part of it, because cruelty rarely announces itself once it's tested your boundaries and found them flexible. Meals continued, always hot enough to seem thoughtful, always bland enough to feel forgettable, and always served when my son wasn't home, as if timing itself had become a tool. The refrigerator began locking at night, not aggressively, not with a warning, just a small click before bedtime. And when I asked about it, she laughed and said it was for the dog, that Lucky had learned how to open doors. That I worried too much, and I nodded like an old woman who didn't know better, even though I had raised a child, balanced a household, and survived decades that taught me when explanations were lies wrapped in humor. I noticed how the cupboards with snacks were suddenly empty, how grocery bags came in lighter than they used to, how her online shopping deliveries grew more frequent while my portions shrank. And still, I said nothing because silence, when chosen, is not weakness, it's reconnaissance. She began correcting me in front of Daniel, gently but loudly enough to embarrass, telling him I was forgetful, that I mixed things up, that I imagined slights, and he believed her not because he was cruel, but because believing her required less effort than questioning what was happening right in front of him. That was the most painful part, not the food, not the jokes, but the way neglect hides behind busyness and love hides behind excuses. I started eating slower, not because my body demanded it, but because I wanted to see how long she'd watch, how quickly impatience crept into her posture, how her kindness evaporated once I stopped performing gratitude. And every time I paused, every time I hesitated, she filled the silence with sighs, with comments about how hard caregiving was, how exhausting it must be to deal with someone at my age. She never said old, not directly, because labels make cruelty obvious, but she said things like fragile and sensitive and confused, words that sound gentle until you realize they're being used to erase you. At night, I lay awake listening to the house, cataloging sounds the way I used to catalog grocery lists, learning patterns, learning timing, because routine is where truth hides when people think you aren't watching. She cooked differently when Daniel was home, fresher food, brighter colors, laughter in her voice, and the difference was so stark it felt almost theatrical, like a performance meant to remind me of where I stood in the hierarchy of that home. I began to understand that this wasn't neglect born of stress or ignorance. It was intentional, measured, and practiced, and the more I complied, the bolder she became, leaving bowls unattended, making comments to friends on speakerphone about how hard it was living with someone who didn't really notice things anymore. And each time she did, I thanked her sweetly. Because gratitude disarms people who expect confrontation. One afternoon, I asked where the bread was, knowing full well it hadn't been bought, and she snapped just for a second before catching herself, and that crack in her composure told me everything I needed to know. She was no longer afraid of me. She thought the story had already been written, that I was a quiet character fading into the background of her life, someone who would endure anything rather than disrupt the peace, and she wasn't entirely wrong about my endurance, just wrong about what it meant. I began to misplace things deliberately, ask the same questions twice on purpose, and watched her confidence grow with every mistake she thought I made, because people reveal their worst selves when they think there are no consequences. Daniel started repeating her words back to me without realizing it, telling me to rest more, to stop worrying, to let things go. And every time he did, something settled inside me, not bitterness, but clarity, the understanding that if I spoke too soon, I would lose not because I was wrong, but because I would be dismissed. I ate what I was given, just enough, discarded the rest carefully, and felt the strange reversal of roles as I became the one managing the household emotionally, smoothing edges, preserving calm, while quietly documenting reality in my mind. I had seen this pattern before, not in my own life, but in friends, neighbors, women who moved in with family after loss or illness and slowly disappeared, their needs minimized until they stopped asking altogether. And I realized then that this wasn't personal cruelty, it was systemic disrespect, the kind that thrives on politeness and patience. The more I played the role she assigned me, the more relaxed she became, speaking freely, complaining openly. And that was when I knew the balance had shifted, not in her favor, but in mine, because she had stopped guarding her behavior. By the end of that week, she served me dinner without even watching me eat, confident I would comply, confident I wouldn't question, confident I wouldn't notice. And as I lifted the spoon again, I understood something crucial. She believed my silence meant ignorance, and that belief was the doorway to her mistake. Because once someone is certain you don't understand what they're doing, they stop hiding how long they've been doing it. What if forgetting wasn't a failure, but a strategy? And what if the very thing people used to dismiss you became the mask that kept you safe long enough to see the truth? That thought didn't arrive all at once. It settled in quietly, the way understanding often does when you finally stop trying to be heard and start trying to observe. By the third week in that house, I had learned exactly how much confusion she expected from me, how slow she wanted my responses to be, how many times I could ask the same question before it annoyed her just enough to let something sharp slip out, and I adjusted myself accordingly, not shrinking, but calibrating. I tilted my head more often, pretended to lose my train of thought mid-sentence, let my voice trail off as if memory had failed me, and every time I did, I felt her relax, shoulders dropping, smile widening, because people are most comfortable when they believe they are in control. I stopped correcting her when she got facts wrong about my own life, nodded when she reminded me of things I knew better than she did, and watched how quickly she stopped filtering her words once she believed I no longer mattered enough to offend. The house grew louder in its honesty. Complaints said without lowering voices, phone calls taken in the open, jokes made at my expense disguised as concern, and through it all, I played my part so well that even my son began to believe it, gently taking things out of my hands, speaking to me slower, like patience was the same thing as respect. It hurt more than I expected, not because I needed his help, but because he didn't question why I suddenly needed it so much, and that realization hardened something inside me, a resolve that felt less like anger and more like preparation. At night, when the house slept, I began keeping track, not on paper where it could be found, but in my phone, hidden behind a harmless title, notes written like reminders and knitting patterns, each entry a quiet reclaiming of reality. I recorded dates, times, what was served, what was said, how she looked at me when she thought I wasn't looking, because memory, when documented, becomes something no one can argue with. During the day, I became exactly what she wanted me to be, forgetful enough to dismiss, compliant enough to ignore, and in that space of underestimation, I learned more than I ever could have by confronting her outright. She stopped checking whether I finished my meals, stopped pretending the food was the same as theirs, stopped hiding her irritation when I took too long to move from one room to another, and with every small cruelty she allowed herself, she handed me another piece of the truth. I began leaving small amounts of food untouched on purpose, wrapping them carefully, slipping them into my purse like evidence, not because I needed to prove anything yet, but because I trusted my instincts enough to know this wasn't going to end quietly. She started locking more than just the fridge, drawers, cupboards, spaces that once belonged to everyone now guarded as if I were the threat. And when I asked about it, she laughed, told me I was imagining things, and I laughed too, because nothing disarms a lie faster than agreement. My body moved slower, but my mind sharpened, every interaction filed away, every inconsistency noted, because when people believe you are declining, they stop protecting themselves, and that is when patterns emerge. I noticed how deliveries arrived when Daniel wasn't home, how boxes were quickly broken down and hidden, how certain labels never stayed visible for long, and I let my eyes linger just enough to memorize without drawing attention. One morning, I pretended not to recognize a neighbor I'd known for years, and she corrected me loudly, explaining who the woman was as if I weren't standing there, and I thanked her sweetly, feeling the strange calm that comes when you know exactly what someone thinks of you. That calm wasn't peace, it was clarity, the understanding that this role I was playing wasn't permanent, it was temporary, and temporary roles don't define who you are, they protect who you're becoming. I had lived too long to confuse obedience with defeat, and as I moved through the house that day, slower than necessary, quieter than usual, I realized that the story she thought she was writing had already slipped out of her control. That evening, as she placed another bowl in front of me without explanation, without eye contact, I smiled again, thanked her again, and took one careful bite, not to taste, but to confirm, because confirmation turns suspicion into certainty. I excused myself early, claiming fatigue, and once the door closed behind me, I sat on the edge of the bed and allowed myself one deep breath, not of relief, but of resolve, because pretending to forget had given me something far more valuable than confrontation ever could. It had given me access, and access, when paired with patience, becomes leverage, because once I stopped correcting her, she stopped hiding the proof. Under what circumstances does truth stop needing your voice and start speaking for itself, and how long would you wait if you knew that proof, once gathered, could never be argued away? By the time I reached what I privately called my fourth week of silence, I understood that words were no longer my strongest tool, and they hadn't been for a while. Proof doesn't rush, it doesn't demand attention, and it doesn't care whether anyone is ready to hear it. It simply exists, patient and undeniable, waiting for the right moment to be placed in the light. I moved through the house with the same careful slowness she expected, but now every step had purpose, every pause had intention, because pretending to forget had sharpened my awareness rather than dulled it. I started noticing the small details she never thought mattered, the way certain deliveries arrived in plain packaging, the way labels disappeared before trash day, the way receipts were never left where I could see them, and how confident she had become that I wouldn't question anything anymore. I learned the rhythm of her habits, which cupboards she opened when she was distracted, how long she stayed in the shower. When her phone buzzed with notifications, she assumed I couldn't read fast enough to understand, and I realized something important. People who feel unobserved grow careless. One afternoon, while she was on a loud phone call complaining about how exhausting caregiving was, I quietly opened the trash drawer and saw it again, that same brand name I'd glimpsed before, the kind of product that tried too hard to look premium, and this time I didn't hesitate. I didn't confront, I didn't accuse, I didn't even react outwardly. I simply took my phone from my pocket and captured what my eyes had already memorized, careful with the angle, careful with the light, careful not to draw attention, because evidence gathered quietly carries more weight than accusations thrown in anger. From that moment on, documentation became my routine, as normal to me as brushing my teeth, and every day added another layer to the truth she believed was buried. I photographed labels before they were peeled away, boxes before they were flattened, delivery confirmations left open on screens when she assumed I wasn't paying attention, and each image felt less like revenge and more like balance being slowly restored. At night, I transferred everything to a secure place, renaming files, organizing dates, writing notes that explained context, not because I was afraid of forgetting, but because I knew others would need clarity later. She continued her routine, growing more relaxed, more dismissive, making jokes about my memory in front of friends, laughing when I asked questions she thought I'd already asked. And every time she did, she added credibility to the story my evidence was already telling. I noticed how the meals never changed when Daniel was gone, how portions remained small, how ingredients stayed suspiciously consistent, and how no effort was made to disguise the difference between what I was served and what the rest of the household enjoyed. One morning, I deliberately asked about an item I knew hadn't been purchased in weeks, and when she snapped before catching herself, the irritation on her face confirmed what I already knew. This wasn't neglect born of ignorance, it was control exercised through routine. I began keeping a mental timeline alongside my written one, noting when the first questionable meal appeared, how quickly it became normal, and how confidently she acted once she believed I had accepted it. Even my body responded differently now, not with fear, but with steadiness, because fear thrives on uncertainty, and uncertainty disappears when patterns become clear. I stopped wondering if I was wrong and started focusing on how long it had been happening, because duration turns an incident into a case. The house itself felt different once I stopped doubting myself, less oppressive, less confusing, because clarity removes the fog that manipulators rely on. She grew so comfortable that she left an order confirmation open on a tablet one afternoon, the screen glowing softly on the counter while she stepped away. And I took my time, not rushing, not panicking, reading every line like I was reading a recipe, noting the recurring nature of the purchase, the quantities, the dates, and the address they were shipped to. And when I photographed it, my hands didn't shake at all. That surprised me because I had expected anger or grief or something dramatic, but all I felt was certainty, the calm that comes when suspicion finally meets confirmation. I closed the tablet exactly how I found it, returned to my chair, and waited because waiting was now my advantage. She never noticed, never suspected, never questioned why I seemed more relaxed than usual, why I stopped asking questions altogether, why I smiled more easily, and that was when I knew she had fully underestimated me. Proof was no longer something I hoped to find. It was something I was actively collecting, piece by piece, day by day, with patience she mistook for passivity. By the end of that week, I had more than feelings, more than instincts, more than quiet humiliation. I had a record, and records don't forget, don't exaggerate, don't get dismissed as confusion. They wait. And I was waiting too, not for an apology, not for understanding, but for the right moment to decide what came next. Because once the proof was complete, I knew exactly who needed to see it first. Who do you call when the people closest to you have already decided not to hear you? And how do you choose the one person who won't confuse your calm for confusion? That question stayed with me for an entire night as I lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of a house that no longer felt like a home, the soft ticking of the clock, the low hum of appliances, the quiet certainty that I could not carry what I now knew by myself. I understood then that proof, no matter how solid, needs the right witness, someone who sees clarity where others see inconvenience, someone who understands that silence does not mean consent. By morning, my decision was made, not out of desperation, but out of trust, because there is a difference between asking for help and choosing an ally. I waited until the house emptied into its usual routines, until she left for errands and my son was at work, and I used a phone she didn't know existed, one I'd kept active for years precisely because independence, even small independence, matters more than people realize. When the call connected, I didn't dramatize, didn't rush, didn't plead because panic invites doubt, and I had learned better than that. I spoke slowly, clearly, laying out facts the way I'd always laid out instructions when teaching, trusting that the right person would hear the structure beneath the story. There was a pause on the other end, not disbelief, not shock, but attention. And in that pause, I felt something shift inside me, the weight of carrying this alone lifting just enough to let me breathe. I was careful with my words, not because I was afraid, but because I knew the difference between accusation and explanation, and I chose explanation every time. I described patterns instead of moments, timelines instead of feelings, evidence instead of insults, because I wanted understanding, not sympathy. When I finished, there was another pause, longer this time, and then a response that didn't rush to comfort me or minimize what I'd said, but acknowledged it exactly as it was: serious, deliberate, and wrong. That response told me everything I needed to know. I had chosen correctly. From that point on, the story was no longer just mine. It was shared, carried by someone who knew how to handle weight without dropping it. We spoke quietly, carefully, agreeing on one thing above all else: that nothing would change yet, that behavior would stay the same, routines would remain intact, and patience would be our shield. It felt strange, agreeing to continue eating meals I no longer trusted, to continue playing the role she had assigned me. But I understood now that this wasn't endurance for survival's sake, it was endurance for resolution. The person on the other end of the call didn't tell me what to do. They asked me what I wanted, and that question alone restored something I hadn't realized I'd lost: the right to define my own outcome. I told them I wanted truth exposed without theatrics, accountability without chaos, and safety without begging for it, and they didn't laugh or hesitate. They simply said it was possible. That word settled into me like a promise, not loud, not dramatic, but steady. Over the next few days, we spoke in fragments, short updates, confirmations that what I'd documented mattered, that the timeline I'd built was clear, that the evidence was strong enough to stand on its own. I didn't share everything at once because trust grows when it's tested gradually, and with each conversation, I felt more certain that I wasn't imagining anything, that my silence had not been foolish, that my patience had purpose. Meanwhile, in the house, nothing appeared different on the surface, and that was exactly how I wanted it. She grew even more comfortable, more careless, assuming whatever phase she thought I was in had settled permanently, and I let her believe that, nodding, smiling, complying, because confidence is what makes people sloppy. Meals continued, remarks continued, dismissals continued, but now they landed differently, not as wounds, but as confirmations that I was doing the right thing by waiting. There's a peculiar calm that comes when you know you are no longer alone, when someone else holds the same facts and sees the same picture, and that calm made it easier to endure the remaining days without breaking character. I stopped wondering whether I should speak up and started focusing on when, because timing is as important as truth, and the wrong timing can bury even the clearest facts. Each night I reviewed what I had gathered, organizing, labeling, preparing, not because I expected a confrontation soon, but because preparation is a form of self-respect. I noticed how my body felt lighter despite the tension, how my sleep improved even as the situation remained unchanged, and I realized that safety doesn't always come from escape. Sometimes it comes from knowing you have a way out. The call I made didn't solve anything immediately, didn't change what I was served or how I was treated, but it changed something more important. It shifted the balance of power quietly, invisibly, in a way she could not sense. By the end of that week, I understood that whatever happened next would not be decided by her confidence or my silence, but by what we now shared: a clear, documented truth and a plan that did not rely on her cooperation. And once I knew I wasn't alone anymore, I stopped wondering if this would end and started deciding how. What happens when humiliation meets preparation, and how different does the room feel when you walk into it knowing you are no longer guessing, no longer hoping, but certain? By the time I reached what I privately counted as the sixth part of this quiet unraveling, my days had taken on a strange double life. One version lived out loud, compliant, and unremarkable, the other unfolding silently beneath the surface, structured, deliberate, and steady. I continued to accept the bowls placed in front of me, continued to thank her with a politeness she mistook for submission, and continued to move at the pace she expected, but inside, everything had shifted. I was no longer enduring, I was timing. The person I had called stayed in careful contact, never pushing, never rushing me, simply asking for updates and reminding me that consistency mattered more than confrontation. Together, without ever speaking the word aloud, we were building something that could not be undone by excuses or emotion. I began organizing what I had collected, not just storing it, but arranging it in a way that told a story anyone could follow, dates aligned, images labeled, notes clarified, because evidence is only powerful when it is understood. Each night, I reviewed the material, making sure nothing relied on interpretation alone, that every detail stood on its own, because I knew how easily truth can be questioned when it's wrapped in feelings. Meanwhile, she grew more confident than ever, her comments sharper, her patience thinner, her sense of superiority fully formed, and I watched it all with a calm that surprised even me. She stopped pretending meals were shared, stopped pretending I was included, and began openly referring to me as an obligation rather than a person. And each time she did, she added another layer of credibility to what I was preparing. The house felt smaller now, not because of walls, but because the illusion of family had collapsed, replaced by routine control and quiet exclusion. One evening, she announced that relatives would be visiting soon, that there would be a dinner, that things needed to look normal, and she said it not as a request, but as an instruction, and in that moment, something inside me clicked into place. Normal, I realized, is what people rely on when they think no one will challenge the story they've been telling. I nodded, smiled, and agreed, already knowing that normal was about to work against her. Over the next few days, I prepared without changing my behavior because the most effective shifts are invisible until they're complete. I made sure everything I had was backed up, copied, and clear, that no single piece stood alone, that every claim could be supported by more than one source because redundancy is protection. I paid attention to how she behaved when she thought she was being watched and how differently she behaved when she thought she wasn't, noting the contrast, understanding that witnesses change behavior and privacy reveals truth. She began making comments about how difficult it was to care for someone my age, loud enough for neighbors to hear, positioning herself as patient, burdened, and generous, and I let her, because self pity often becomes the framework abusers use to justify their actions. The closer the dinner grew, the more she performed, cooking elaborate meals she never shared with me, laughing loudly, telling stories that centered her effort and sacrifice, and I recognized the pattern clearly now. She was preparing an audience. I stayed quiet, stayed small, stayed exactly as she expected, because nothing disarms control like predictability. Inside, however, I felt grounded, steady in a way I hadn't felt since before the fall that brought me there, because I knew that when the moment arrived, I would not be speaking from pain, but from preparation. The night before the gathering, I sat alone in my room, reviewing everything one last time, not with fear, but with resolve, understanding that tomorrow would not be about confrontation, but revelation. I slept better than I had in weeks, not because the situation had improved, but because clarity replaces anxiety when you finally know where you stand. In the morning, she moved through the house with rehearsed cheerfulness, reminding me where to sit, when to speak, and when to stay quiet, and I agreed to all of it, because compliance, when chosen, can be the most powerful position of all. As the day unfolded, I felt no urge to argue, no desire to defend myself, because defense assumes accusation, and I wasn't planning to accuse anyone. I was planning to let facts do the talking. By the time the table was set and the house filled with voices, I understood that this was no longer about what she had done to me, but about what she believed she had gotten away with, and that belief was about to meet something far less forgiving than anger. Because when everyone finally sat down together, I wasn't bringing emotion to the table, I was bringing proof. What if the moment you're most afraid of isn't the one where you're exposed, but the one where everyone else is, and you're the only person who knows it's coming? By the time the house filled with voices and familiar faces, I understood that this wasn't a confrontation in the way people imagine confrontations to be, loud and messy and fueled by rage, but something quieter and far more unsettling because quiet forces people to listen. I sat where I was told to sit, at the edge of the table, the place assigned to me without discussion, and watched the performance unfold exactly as I had predicted it would, her laughter practiced, her gestures generous, her stories carefully curated to present herself as patient and long-suffering, and every compliment she received only tightened the knot of certainty inside me. Plates were passed, glasses filled, conversation drifted from whether to work to harmless memories, and all the while I said very little, not because I had nothing to say, but because silence, when chosen deliberately, draws attention without demanding it. When the meal reached that comfortable midpoint where people relax, when forks slow and voices lower, I felt the shift, that subtle moment when everyone believes the evening has settled into safety, and I knew it was time not to interrupt, not to accuse, but to clarify. I reached into my bag calmly, without drama, and placed a simple folder on the table, not sliding it toward anyone, not announcing it, just setting it down where it could be seen, because curiosity is a powerful force, and people notice what doesn't belong. Someone asked what it was, casually, politely, and I answered just as casually, saying it was something I'd been keeping track of since I moved in, nothing more, nothing less, and the room grew quieter, not tense yet, just attentive. She laughed lightly, dismissively, making a comment about my notes and my memory, and I smiled, not offended, because that dismissal was expected, necessary even, for what came next to land properly. I opened the folder slowly, laying out the contents one by one, not rushing, not explaining unless asked, letting the images speak for themselves, dates visible, labels clear, timelines obvious, and with each page I felt the air change, the way it does when a story stops being hypothetical and becomes undeniable. Questions began, tentative at first, then more direct, and I answered them calmly, never raising my voice, never adding commentary, because facts don't need decoration. She tried to interrupt, to explain, to laugh it off, but explanations sound hollow when they arrive after proof, and the more she spoke, the more disjointed she became, her confidence fraying as she realized this wasn't a misunderstanding she could smooth over. I watched my son's face change as he followed the evidence from beginning to end, recognition replacing confusion, guilt settling in where denial had lived, and for the first time since I'd arrived, I saw him fully present, not distracted, not defensive, but awake. When someone asked how long it had been happening, I answered honestly, giving dates instead of feelings, durations instead of grievances, and the room held that information heavily, because duration turns discomfort into intent. She finally stopped talking, her silence loud now, and in that space I spoke again, not about food, not about treatment, but about assumptions, about what happens when someone decides another person no longer deserves explanation, and how dangerous it is to confuse quiet with consent. I didn't ask for apologies, didn't demand understanding, because I wasn't there to negotiate my dignity, I was there to reclaim it. When I finished, I closed the folder gently, as if to signal that the evidence had said all it needed to say, and the room remained still, not shocked, not angry, just changed. It was then that I understood something I hadn't fully grasped before. This wasn't the end of the story, it was the turning point, the moment where control shifts without anyone raising their voice. I stood slowly, not because my legs demanded it, but because standing marked the end of my role as a silent observer, and I told them I would be leaving soon, not in anger, not in haste, but because staying was no longer necessary. That was when she reacted, not with tears, but with disbelief, asking where I thought I would go, what I thought I could do, and I realized she still believed the house itself was leverage. I looked at her calmly and said nothing, because some truths land better when they're held for just a moment longer, allowed to ripen in the silence. I returned to my seat, letting conversation stumble back into motion awkwardly, and as the evening drew to a close, I felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a deep sense of rightness, because dignity, once reclaimed, doesn't need applause. But there was one truth I hadn't shared yet, the one that would change who had the right to stay. Have you ever watched confidence collapse in real time, not with a crash, but with a slow, almost silent unraveling that no one can stop once it begins? That's what part 8 felt like, not dramatic in the way movies promise, but far more unsettling because reality doesn't explode, it erodes. After that evening, the house changed its tone completely, as if the walls themselves had absorbed what had been revealed and no longer agreed to hold secrets. Conversations stopped mid sentence when I entered a room, footsteps hesitated outside my door, and the certainty she once moved with was replaced by a sharp, restless energy that followed her everywhere. She tried first to regain control with politeness, offering smiles that came too late, speaking softly as if volume alone had been the problem before. But when that didn't work, when I didn't retreat back into the quiet role she preferred, the politeness vanished. Her voice sharpened, her questions grew accusatory, asking who I had spoken to, what I thought I was doing, whether I understood the consequences of embarrassing her, and I listened calmly because once someone starts defending themselves, they've already accepted that something is wrong. My son avoided my eyes for days, not out of cruelty, but shame, the kind that paralyses instead of motivates. And I realized then that silence had spread through the house like a contagion, only now it belonged to them, not me. She tried to reframe the story, telling relatives it was a misunderstanding, that I'd been confused, that stress had made things seem worse than they were, and I didn't argue, because arguing would have given her narrative something to push against. Instead, I stayed consistent, unchanged, answering only when spoken to, repeating the same simple truth without embellishment, because lies grow weaker the more they have to stretch. The tension thickened, turning every shared space into a negotiation, and I felt the strange reversal of power as she became the one watching me, measuring my reactions, trying to predict my next move, because uncertainty is terrifying when you're used to control. One afternoon, she cornered me in the kitchen, her voice low and urgent, asking what I wanted, offering compromises, promises, even apologies that sounded more like bargaining than remorse, and I told her the truth she least expected. I wanted peace, not permission. That answer unsettled her more than anger ever could because peace can't be negotiated away. The house grew quieter after that, not calmer, just emptier, as if everyone was waiting for something inevitable but unnamed. I began packing slowly, deliberately, not hiding it, not announcing it, folding clothes, sorting belongings, letting the reality of my departure become visible, because visibility was now my choice. She watched from doorways, pretending indifference, but the fear underneath was unmistakable fear not of me, but of what my leaving would represent: a loss of narrative, a loss of authority, a loss of control she could not reclaim. My son finally spoke one evening, his voice tentative, asking if there was any way to move past this, and I looked at him with a clarity that surprised us both, telling him that moving past something requires acknowledging where you are, and he wasn't there yet. That conversation ended quietly, without resolution, but with understanding, because some lessons can't be rushed without being lost entirely. She tried one last tactic then, not confrontation, but guilt, reminding me of sacrifices, of effort, of how hard it was to manage everything, positioning herself as overwhelmed rather than responsible. And I listened, not unsympathetic, but unmoved, because hardship explains behavior, it doesn't excuse it. By the end of that week, the dynamic had fully inverted. She was the one whispering, the one careful, the one uncertain, and I moved through the house with a steadiness that came from knowing I no longer needed approval or understanding to protect myself. I realized then that consequences don't always arrive in the form of punishment. Sometimes they arrive as loss of influence, loss of comfort, loss of the certainty that once allowed someone to behave without restraint. The day I finished packing my last bag, she stood at the end of the hallway watching, not stopping me, not apologizing, just absorbing the weight of what was happening. And for the first time, I saw her clearly, not powerful, not cruel, just small and exposed. I walked past her without a word, not out of spite, but because nothing more needed to be said. And as I closed the door behind me, I understood that this chapter wasn't ending in victory or defeat, but in transition. And just when she thought losing control was the worst part, I revealed the truth about the house itself. What does safety actually feel like when you haven't felt it in a long time? And how do you recognize peace when it arrives quietly instead of announcing itself? I asked myself that question not when I left the house, but later, after the door had closed behind me and the world didn't collapse the way I'd been bracing for. The drive away felt unreal at first, the familiar streets of Indiana sliding past the window like scenes from a life I had already outgrown. And with every mile, the tension I'd been carrying loosened its grip just a little more. I didn't rush, didn't look back, didn't replay conversations in my head the way I used to, because something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer negotiating my dignity. When I arrived at the place that would become my new home, it didn't look impressive, and that was part of its charm. No polished surfaces meant to impress visitors, no locked spaces, no sense that I needed permission to exist. The air smelled like real food, not cleaning products, and that small detail alone almost undid me, because I hadn't realized how deeply fear had embedded itself into my senses. I unpacked slowly, not because I was tired, but because I wanted to feel each decision, each item placed exactly where I chose, reclaiming autonomy one ordinary action at a time. That first night, I slept without listening for footsteps, without bracing for criticism, without rehearsing explanations in my mind, and when I woke up, the silence felt different, not heavy or watchful, but open. In the days that followed, I noticed changes in my body before my thoughts caught up, my appetite returning, my shoulders relaxing, my breath deepening, because safety often shows up physically before it ever becomes a belief. I cooked again, simple meals made from ingredients I chose myself, standing in a kitchen where nothing was hidden from me, where the refrigerator opened freely and nothing inside it carried shame. Each meal felt like a small act of restoration, not dramatic, not symbolic, just human, and with every bite, I remembered who I had been before survival required strategy. People around me treated me differently too, not cautiously, not condescendingly, but normally, asking my opinions, respecting my pace, trusting my competence, and that normalcy was more powerful than any apology could have been. I spent time outside, walked when I felt like it, rested when I didn't, and for the first time in months, my days weren't structured around avoidance or vigilance. I still thought about what had happened, of course, but the memories no longer felt sharp. They felt contained, like a chapter I could revisit without being pulled back into it. Occasionally, messages arrived, tentative, apologetic, unclear about what they were asking for, and I read them without urgency, understanding that I didn't owe immediate access to anyone who had once ignored my humanity. Healing, I learned, isn't about forgetting what hurt you. It's about building a life where that hurt no longer dictates your choices. I surrounded myself with routines that felt grounding rather than restrictive, morning light through the window, familiar music, conversations that didn't require me to perform gratitude for basic respect. Slowly, the part of me that had been watching, measuring, and calculating relaxed because it finally understood it wasn't needed anymore. I wasn't waiting for the next move or preparing for another test. I was living. And in that living, I felt something I hadn't expected grief, not for what I lost, but for how long I had accepted less than I deserved. That grief passed gently, without bitterness, replaced by gratitude for the clarity that had come from hardship rather than despite it. I knew I wasn't finished yet, that one final piece of the story still needed to be faced, but now I was facing it from a place of stability rather than survival. The quiet I lived in now wasn't silence imposed on me. It was silence I chose, and that difference made all the difference in the world. And just when life began to feel whole again, a letter arrived that I never expected and never answered. What happens after the story ends, when there's no audience left to impress, no proof left to present, and no strength left to prove, only the truth of who you are when no one is watching? That was the question I didn't realize I'd been carrying until the letter arrived, thin paper, familiar handwriting, placed gently in my mailbox as if care alone could undo what had already been done. I stood there for a long moment holding it, not shaking, not angry, just aware that this was the final test, not of forgiveness, but of clarity. I read it once slowly, words heavy with regret and explanations that came far too late, acknowledgments wrapped in self justification, apologies that focused more on discomfort than accountability. And when I finished, I folded it neatly and set it aside, not because it didn't matter, but because it no longer controlled me. Some apologies are meant to heal the person who gives them, not the one who receives them, and I had learned the difference the hard way. I didn't write back, not out of punishment, but out of self respect, because silence, when chosen freely, can be a boundary rather than a wound. Life continued quietly after that, not dramatic, not perfect, but grounded in something I hadn't had before: certainty. I woke up each morning knowing what kind of day awaited me, not because I planned every detail, but because nothing in my home required vigilance. I cooked meals meant for people, shared stories without censoring myself, laughed without wondering who might use it against me later, and in those ordinary moments, I felt something stronger than revenge ever could be. Dignity restored, I thought often about how easily strength is misread when it's quiet, how many women like me are dismissed not because they lack intelligence, but because they choose patience over spectacle, and I understood then why my story needed to be told, not to shame anyone, not to seek sympathy, but to leave a record. Age does not erase awareness. Silence does not equal ignorance. Kindness is not consent. These truths settled into me as guiding principles rather than lessons learned too late. I spent time reflecting on the woman I had been before everything unraveled: the mother, the worker, the partner, the person who had built a life with care and consistency, and I realized she had never disappeared. She had simply adapted long enough to survive. There is power in adaptation when it's paired with self trust, and there is danger when others mistake it for weakness. I didn't need justice in a courtroom to feel complete, because accountability had already arrived in the form of consequences that could not be undone, and peace followed close behind. The house I lived in now felt like a continuation rather than an escape, a place where my past informed my future without defining it, and that balance was something I protected fiercely. Occasionally, I caught myself smiling at small things: sunlight on the counter, a familiar song, the comfort of routine, and I knew then that healing doesn't announce itself. It integrates quietly until one day you realize you're no longer bracing for impact. If there is one thing I would leave behind for anyone listening to my story, it is this: pay attention to your instincts, especially when the world tells you to doubt them, because intuition is memory speaking in advance. I didn't lose my mind. I didn't miss the signs. I noticed everything. I waited. And when the moment came, I remembered who I was before anyone tried to convince me otherwise. They thought I wouldn't notice, but noticing was never the problem, waiting was the strategy.